And there's a general law in kitesurfing that states that the more boring a board looks, the more boring it's going to ride. But boring isn't necessarily a bad thing. Okay, this is a really, really simple way of breaking it down. So take these two boards. Which of them looks like it's going to be more dynamic, more exciting, more interesting to ride? Well, if you're normal, you probably said this one is going to be the more exciting one. It looks more dynamic, it's got a more nice aggressive rails, cool looking. Yeah, okay, all these things factor in, a few ridges, a few channels, a few V's going on. It's got all these sort of exciting bits compared to this one, which, to be fair, looks a little bit like a door. Okay? And that's a really, really simple guide to a kitesurfing board. The first thing you want to look at is look at the board. How does it look? If it looks big, square, door-like, it's probably going to feel big, square and door-like to ride. If it looks really dynamic, really aggressive, really interesting to ride, it's probably going to be quite interesting to ride. So that's a really, really simple way of looking at it, but not very scientific. So what we'll do is we'll try and break that down into slightly more technical terms so you've got a framework to start looking at boards and deciding how they're going to ride. So the first thing we're going to look at with these boards is what's called the outline, the actual shape of the board. So that includes the length, the width, and how sort of dynamic, how cut off, how square the corners are. So you can see this board has got a very square outline. It's very long, it's very wide, and it's got quite square corners, okay? That means it's basically designed for two purposes, either for a beginner or for a light wind, okay? As opposed to this one, which is much shorter, much narrower across the middle, and has these cut-off corners, which again will make it slightly more exciting to ride, slightly more freestyle, slightly more wake style orientated to ride, okay? Why? Well, first of all, this board, because it's longer, because it's wider, has a bigger surface area. So when it's riding along, let's say you're riding along in one direction, there's a lot more of the board in the water, okay? So it provides more float. So there's going to be a lot more float provided by that board at any one point, as opposed to this one where, because of the smaller surface area, at any one point of riding there's going to be less board actually engaged in the water at that point. So it's going to mean that this board, when you're riding along with it, there's a lot of surface area, so if the power in the kite suddenly dies due to A, lack of wind, or B, pilot error, which is something that happens a lot in beginner kite surfers, the board will keep on floating. This one will sink rapidly. So this board is a lot more forgiving in light winds, or if you're not quite confident with power through the kite. This board you need to have consistent power to keep it riding, to keep it planing at the same time, because there's less surface area in the water. Okay? So that's the first and most obvious one. The second thing to look at here, which has an effect on how the board works, is the corners themselves. Okay? If you imagine again, going back to this idea of surface area, how much of this board, or this board for that matter, do you think is actually engaged in the water when you're riding? Well, let's have a look. Realistically, let's take this board for example. I would expect probably, let's say we're riding in that direction, probably about this much of the board to be actually engaged in the water. So about a third of the board is what we call the wetted area. The rest of the board is actually out of the water. This is why when you look at your fins, you've got 4 fins, but only 2 are going in the right direction. That's for your heel side, that's for your toe side. The other 2 are backwards, so they don't get engaged at all. They shouldn't be engaged at all. This one might be engaged in choppy water, might give you a bit of extra grip in choppy water, but really if you were riding on glass flat water, I would expect only the one heel side fin to be engaged, and that corresponds to roughly this third of the board. So, what does that mean? Well, it means if I've got these cut off corners as opposed to these fairly square corners, there's even less of the board being engaged, even less surface area. So the more taper I've got toward the edges of the board, the less surface area I've got, the less lift I've got. So again, with these cut off corners, the board is going to sink faster. But what's the advantage of the cut off corners? Well, when it comes to turning the board, it again means that there's that much less board engaged. It's much easier to flatten out the board to initiate a turn, as opposed to say on this board, where because it's got the huge square corners, I've got to disengage all that surface area to start to initiate a turn. So this board's much easier to turn. The easiest way to think of board design is as a compromise between straight line stability and turning. This is really what it comes down to. There are a few extra factors in there, but they're the main ones, okay? So this board, as we come to it from the outline, is going to be very straight, very stable in a straight line, sorry. This board is going to be much better at turning. Something else which makes this board stable in a straight line is the fact that the rails themselves, the outline of the board here, is straight. So the water is going to release off of this board much more in a straight line. And again, Newton's theory, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. On this one, as the water's shooting off that way, it's trying to turn the board the other way. Whereas this one, because the water's releasing off more or less straight, it's much more comfortable to track in a straight line because the water that's releasing off the back of the board is holding the board into a straight line and not trying to turn the board. So it takes much less effort to keep the board going in a straight line. So they're the three main things I would look for in outline. You're looking for the actual size and width. That's the big one because that gives you the surface area. Then look at the corners. The more corners, it means the more stable, the more straight line ability you've got, but the less turning ability you've got. Okay, so the next thing we want to look at is the rocker line. The rocker line is this line here. So you can see on this board that the board's quite curved. It goes from the middle and there's a fair bit of bow in the board up towards the fins. Compare that with this board, which is pretty much flat. Okay, so what difference does the rocker line make? Well, again, it goes back to this idea of straight line stability versus turning ability. Quite simply, the more rocker line in the board, the easier it's going to turn. Why? Because look, imagine I'm riding along in this direction. With the rocker line, again, there's my wetted area, but look, the board itself is curving up out of the water. So there's even less surface area on the water. Also, when I come to turn, it's much easier to flatten that off because the board itself is bowed. So it's easy to flatten the board off and then do some rolling carve turns if you want. But it means that there's much less ability to track in a straight line, again, because, well, you've got less board engaged, so there's less resistance pushing against the kite, so there's less power shooting you forward. Compare that to a nice square board, a nice flat board, sorry, where when you've got the board at an angle like this, because there's no rocker line, a huge amount or a much bigger percentage of the board is engaged, and you can see there's no curve upwards there away from the water itself. So when I want to come to disengage, I've got to disengage the whole board, and then when it's flat, pretty much the whole board is flat on the water, which is going to be a nightmare if I'm trying to ride it in chop, which is why these sorts of boards are designed for light winds, because in light winds generally there's not a lot of chop going on. So the rocker line, again, really affects this straight line speed versus turning ability. The more rocker line in general, i.e. the more bowed the board is, the more the board's going to want to turn. But the less stable it's going to be in a straight line. One advantage of a rocker can be in chop or waves is that obviously the kite board molds to the shape of the waves. So it becomes a little bit smoother to ride in chop rather than just trying to punch through the chop. And as we've already said, the flat board, it tends to get caught on the chop because it's got no ability to mould. Every little bit of chop it will hit, and it can be quite uncomfortable to ride in chop. So although these boards are great for beginners, because again, the idea that you've got a lot of stability in a straight line, they can become difficult in chop because they get caught on every little bit of chop as you're riding through it. Now there's become a de facto standard test in kite surfing. Whenever you buy a new board, you'll take it down the beach, you'll give it to your friend, you'll say, look, I've just bought this new board. And he'll stick his knee in the middle of the board and try and bend the hell out of it until you're nearly crying watching him do it. If it bends an awful lot, he'll hand it back to you. He'll say, that's a great board, I want to try it, give me a go. If it doesn't bend a lot, he'll probably shrug his shoulders and go, yeah, whatever, I'll stick with my board. For some reason, this concept of flex, how much a board flexes, how much a board bends, has become a de facto standard for quality, and it's simply not true. Flex can be a great thing, but flex can be a nightmare, just like all these things we're looking at. Again, imagine flex is like suspension in a car.
Does a car with more or with softer suspension travel faster or slower than a car with hard suspension? Yeah, it travels slower. Why? Because the forward motion is being absorbed by the suspension. So you're not getting directional movement. A car with hard suspension will be much more jolty to ride, but it travels much faster in a straight line because its forward energy isn't being absorbed by the bumps and lumps along the road. Exactly the same for a kite surfing board. So, but also with a kite surfing board, we're talking about energy transfer. So we're taking energy from the kite, transferring it through you, through the harness, through your legs, into the board. Now imagine if you're riding a board made of cardboard. That is a board with a huge amount of flex. But when you come to try and pop, when you come to try and jump, when basically what you're doing is you try to transfer as much energy through the kite, through your body, into the board as possible to generate upwards motion, that board's simply going to fold. And all that power is going to be absorbed by the suspension, i.e. the flex in the board, and you're just going to sink. Likewise, if you're riding a titanium board, or something that's very stiff, as you come to transfer that power, there's going to be instant power transfer, but that board is going to be so unforgiving riding over chop that you probably have to replace your knees within 2 weeks. Okay, so this is where flex is slightly misunderstood. Flex can be a great thing if, for example, you ride in a choppy location, or you want a nice smooth ride, or you've got knees that hurt generally, go for a board with more flex. But if you're a freestyler looking to do big aerial moves and then chase back upwind, flex is the last thing you want, because flex is going to absorb all that power going into the board when you jump and to absorb the power when you're trying to ride upwind. Now, why is that not quite true? Because actually, what else does the flex do? It absorbs the energy when you're landing from a jump. So a freestyle board won't necessarily have zero flex, but you start to see, hopefully, how all board designers are compromised. How ideally what you'd have is a board that can stiffen at certain points when you're trying to do something, and then has a lot of flex when you're trying to do something else. Obviously we can't do that at the moment with the given materials. I wouldn't be surprised if we can in a few years' time. But this is where flex can or can't be a good thing. What else can we not talk, do we have to talk about when we're talking about flex? Well, there's a few things to give you a hint. The first one is the rocker line. Flex dynamically affects the rocker line. So the more I weigh, for example, and the more flex the board's got, the more that rocker line is going to change as I'm riding. This is why a board that rides well for me probably won't ride well for you. Because A, I'm heavier than you, I might be lighter than you, I might be taller than you, I might be shorter than you, I might have a different stance to you, and this is something we'll talk about in a minute, all of which change the rocker line of that board. So it means it's not actually the same board for me as it is for you. It's a totally different board. So this is why when your mate comes down the beach and says, I've just bought the best board ever, you've got to go and ride it or go and buy this. Try it first, because it might ride like a dog for you, because you've got a different rocker line. You're effectively riding a different board. So flex will dynamically affect the rocker line all the time. Okay, and we've hinted to it before as well, but something else which is going to affect the board in that sense is your stance. Do you want a wide stance? Do you want a narrow stance? Now, this is a really personal question, and I would argue that the only important guiding factor on where your stance is comfort. What works for you? What's comfortable for you? That's the best indication. People always ask me, oh, where should I put my footsteps? Where, how wide should I have them? What angle should I have them? What works for you? We all know some people walk with their feet in a straight line. Some people walk and their feet are out almost at 90 degrees. Well, depending on how you walk, depending on how your physiology is set up, that's going to mean that the different stance is more or less comfortable for you. And what works for your best mate almost certainly will not work for you. Try an experiment. But just to get an idea of what stance does, try this little experiment. I want you to stand. Go on, stand up. Go on, stand up. Unless you're at work, in which case people might think you're a little odd, but why are you watching this at work anyway? But stand up, hands by your side, and all we're going to try and do is, without using our arms, spin 360 degrees. So just try it. 1, 2, 3. Okay, now what we're going to do, spread your legs. So bend your legs, spread your legs again, arms by your side, and just try the same exercise. So we're just going to try and spin around 360 degrees. Which of those was easier? Well, if you're normal, which I'm not suggesting you are for a minute, who wants to be normal? But if you're normal, the second one was easier. Why? Because with your legs bent, you can get a huge amount more leverage to spin yourself around. When you've got your legs together, your centre of gravity is in the centre, it's much more difficult to get that leverage, okay, because you've got to use just your upper body generally. So, this is an idea of what stance does. The wider your stance gets, the more control you've got over the tips of the board. So if you're a kind of rider who likes to do a lot of rotational stuff, a wide stance might be awesome. If you're not that type of person, you might want the stance slightly closer. Again, if you're a small person, you might want your stance slightly closer. If you're a tall person, you might want your stance slightly wider. But at least now you know what it does, okay? And what effect you can have on the board. By the way, what else does stance affect? As I widen my stance, does my rocker line become more bowed or flatter? Yeah, it becomes flatter. So I'm changing the rocker line of the board as I change my stance. As I bring my stance narrower, I've got more rocker line. So again, you can start to see that as soon as I change one thing, I'm changing other things as well. So this is why board design is such a nightmare, and this is why as well when manufacturers tell you this board does everything well, it rides upwind, it pops, it's absorbent on the landings, it's good on your knees, it does all these different things. It can't. It can't. A board can't do everything good at once. It has to be, by the laws of the universe, a compromise between some of these things. Okay, and hopefully now you can start to see a little bit about how this works. Okay, so we've talked about the outline, we've talked about the rocker line, we've talked about flex, we've talked about pads and straps. One last thing I want to talk about at the moment, then we're going to get into the board, is the fins. Okay, now just have a quick look. This board has got very, very small fins. This board has got medium fins. And if I got one of our school boards up here, it has much bigger fins, 5 centimetre fins. Now what difference do fins make? Well, fins make a hell of a lot more difference than you think. And the easiest way to test this is to take your fins off and go riding. Believe me, it will blow your mind. Suddenly the board won't track in a straight line, it wants to turn all the time. Surface 360s become almost happening without you thinking about it. It's a very different feel. The fin basically provides extra grip, which you will notice. But without going into the hydrodynamics too much of fins, which blows my mind, what you're basically doing is you're adding more grip. So when you exit turns, when you're riding in a straight line, when you're riding through chop, bigger fins are better. When you're on flatter water, you might want to have smaller fins, so you've got more of a loose, skiddy feel. But what I would advise when you're buying kit is buy your board, have a look at the fins that come with it. Let's say normally on most standard boards these days, most sort of beginner, intermediate boards, free ride boards, and we'll talk more about that later, is a 5 centimetre fin. What I would also do is maybe buy a 2.5 centimetre fin or a 2 centimetre fin, something more that size. Why? Because it means very, very cheaply and very, very quickly you can mix and match your fins for different conditions. So on a day when it's super choppy, you put your big fins on. On a day when it's a bit flatter, you might put your smaller fins on. And it will radically change the way your board feels, radically change your riding style. And what's more, it's a hell of a lot of fun, and it's a very, very, very cheap way to get that extra performance out of your kit without having to buy a new board, because literally it will change the way that board rides. It's like riding a new board, so try it. And what I want you to start doing with all these bits and bobs is playing around with them. Change your stance, change your fins, see how it affects the board. And it was something that I didn't do for ages, mainly because I'm lazy. I can't be bothered changing straps, I can't be bothered fixing fins. And then when a friend of mine forced me to do it, I widened my stance by about 1 centimetre on each side, and my kite surfing improved overnight. Still wasn't good, but I was better than I was beforehand. So you can see how just these tiny, tiny changes might make all the difference for you. What it certainly did for me was stop my knees from aching, which was a big thing, because I used to find after about an hour of riding, my knees really ached. Now I can ride for hours and hours and hours, and it's not a problem. Simply by changing that stance a little bit, by adjusting your duck foot slightly, bringing it in or bringing it out, you might revolutionise your kite surfing. So I really, really do recommend you have a look at this, especially if you've got problems with comfort on your board. And as I say, comfort is the key when you're looking at how duck foot your straps are, or how wide or how narrow your straps are. The key there is comfort. The same with the fins. You'll probably find that there's one size of fins given your board and given your style of riding that you really like, but until you experiment a little bit, you won't know the difference between riding on 5cm fins and 1cm fins, or on no fins if you're wakeboarding, or on super flat water. So go and test it, go and try it out, go and have a look. While we're talking about fins, very quickly, I want to talk about channel. Now, I'm not sure if you can see this on the video. I'll try and get this board at an angle where you can see it. But there, just looking down, there you go. Just looking down the board, you see this bit here. This is what's called a channel. Now, some boards have them. Generally, again, the more kind of advanced free ride or freestyle boards or wake style boards will have these channels. Now, what they do is they complement the fin. So for example on this board, because it's got quite small fins, with that channel, what the channel does is it provides a bit of extra grip, so it acts like a very small fin. And you can see this best if you go and actually look at a wakeboard. Wakeboards have these channels all the time, so some of them have got the 0 fins, so they get all their grip from the channels. What else does it do? Well, you know, we talked about how the water shoots off the rail, and on this board it's curving around, so it's driving the board to turn. Well, as the board releases through the channel, it's releasing in a straight line. So it provides a counter a little bit to this one, which helps make the board a little bit more stable in a straight line. So that's what channels do, and it's something that you probably hear a little bit about, which is why I'm mentioning it now. Okay. The other thing you might hear talked about with boards is the V. Now, the V is basically, and this board is very difficult to see from this angle, but I think this board is pretty much flat, but basically a V would be that. So if the board, and you'll see this more on surf style boards, nowhere near as exaggerated as I'm making it, but I'm just showing it for example purposes, and all that does is make the board easier to turn from one side to another. So it provides a pivot, a fulcrum in the middle, where you can turn your board from side to side. So that's what a V will do as well. So that's just to hopefully explain most of the terms you need to talk about. All we need to talk about now is rails. Okay, so rails. Now we're leaving this to last mainly because I have to go down to the garage and swap the board over. There's no particular reason apart from that. This is no more or less important than anything else. It's just another factor that goes into kiteboard design. Now, what I want to show you first of all, the way we describe rail. First of all, what is a rail? The rail is simply this part of the board, the edge of the board, okay, that runs all the way around. Just a fancy way of saying the edge of the board, okay. Now rails can be divided into two different types of rails. We've got hard or soft rails. Now what does that mean? Well, basically if you look at this surfboard, look at the rails on that surfboard. Can you see how they're nice and rounded as they run down? Okay, they're all rounded all the way down. That's what's called a soft rail. You could also say these are soft and fairly fat. I mean, for a surfboard it's not that fat, but for a kite surfboard they're fairly fat rails. Compare that, I'll be very careful putting this one down, to these rails, which are much sharper, much harder, okay, and much thinner, okay. So you've got these rails which are sharp. You can see what I mean by sharp. They're just very small, very sharp, very right angled, yeah, and the nice soft rails on the surfboard. So what difference does that make? Well, the easiest way to conceptualize what these actually do is imagine if I took the fins off this surfboard and then tried to go snowboarding on it, what would happen? Well, imagine trying to stop this board without fins on snow. As I drive that back heel in, the board would simply keep on skidding. Why? Because the rails are soft, so they provide no grip. Whereas on this board, with the sharper rails, like on a snowboard, when I drive my back heel in to stop, the rail bites because it's sharp. So that hard rail bites the snow, and stops me. And that's the easiest way of thinking about what rail does. So why do we want soft rails on a surfboard? Well, imagine the same thing. Imagine riding down on a powder day on a surfboard with these nice soft rails. Carving is going to be really easy. It's going to be really easy to rock the board from one side to another because the snow just flows around that rail. And this is exactly what we're after on a surfboard. We want to do really nice, carve turns, top and bottom turns on the wave. We want to really be able to transition from side to side really nicely. That's very easy on soft rails. On harder rails, what can happen is that as you're doing that transition, the rail's so sharp that it digs in. Just like we said on the snow, it digs in and sends you flying over the front, which doesn't look too cool in the middle of a wave riding competition when you're trying to impress all the people on the beach. So that's the major difference between hard and soft rails, is this idea of turning. These will provide a lot more grip and a lot better power transfer. So let's say I'm trying to stamp on the back heel to generate upward force in a pop. These rails are much, much better. Why? Because they're sharper, they provide more grip into the water. If I did the same action with these rails, it's kind of flaccid. It kind of doesn't work that well, okay? So that's the major difference in the rail, hard and soft. One thing to note, if you look at the rails on this board, and again, I hope you can see this, look at the rail in the middle, and then look how it tapers towards the end. You can see it's much thinner, much sharper here, and it actually gets a little bit more rounded here. It gets fatter and rounded in the middle. Why is that? Well, it's because, and not all twin tips have this. This is a feature of this board, it's a feature of some boards. If your board doesn't do this, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It's just another feature that you might or may not want. But what it basically means is that at this point here, we've got nice sharp rails, so when I do want to engage that pop and really stamp on the heel, there's a lot of power transfer at the tips of the board. But when I'm riding flatter, when I'm riding more wake style, and I want to transition, so I want to change my weight from my heels to my toe side, it rolls around the softer rail in the middle of the board a little bit easier. So again, it comes down to a compromise. And again, if you look at the surfboard, towards the back of the board, the rail actually gets a bit harder, it gets narrower and a bit sharper. There's actually a right angle at the back of the board there, and it rounds off towards the middle. Again, because with my back foot over the fins, I want to be able to crank the back of the board around to really get some spray off the top of the wave and really crank those top and bottom turns around. So that's what the rail does. So to sum up, hopefully you can see that board design is this constant quest, this constant battle between straight line stability and turning ability, dynamicism, if that's even a word, okay? And everything comes down to this. So what I want to start getting in your head today is as you look at different boards, you can start to see what they're going to do. So going back to our first example, the big board and the smaller board, the big board is a great board to get started on. Why? Because it's stable, it's going to cruise through light winds, it's going to go upwind like the clappers, and it's not going to want to turn too much to start with. So for someone who's just trying to get to that point where they want to ride upwind, that board's awesome. For someone who's a bit more advanced, the other board, or a board like this, might be perfect. But what you'll find if you buy a big board like that is that you might grow out of it very, very quickly. Because after 6 months of riding that, it might get a little bit boring. You might get, okay, this board doesn't really work in chop, it's heavy to jump, it's not really very dynamic, I can't really do much with it, there's not much feedback coming from the board, so you might want to look at changing it. So this is what we talk about a bit later in the buying your first kite surfing board. So what I wanted to give you today was the overview. These are the different things that go into it, so when we actually talk about buying kit and when you walk into a shop what you're looking for, you know what we're talking about, you've got the basic concepts dialed. So I really hope that helped. Any questions, please leave them in the comments and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Nice one guys. See you in the next video. Bye bye.